This is a video short about the history of the railroads through Marienville by Mikado Rail Productions of Dayton, Ohio. Hi, I'm Mike Adams, self-appointed rail historian of the railroads through Marienville. I want to tell the story of the 127 years of rich and colorful history of the railroading through Marienville. There were four distinct major railroads that made it possible. These were the Pittsburgh, Bradford, and Buffalo Railroad, the Pittsburgh and Western Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, also known as the B&O, and finally the Knox and Kane Railroad. In this video, I will talk more about each of these. I will begin telling the story by talking about things that I saw, heard, and felt firsthand. It will help you understand why I'm so passionate about trains in general and so obsessed with the history of the train through Marienville specifically. You see, I grew up in Marienville and lived there from 1950 until 1972. The B&O was my favorite and was an inescapable part of my life. My parents, Jerry and Liv Adams, ran a popular restaurant called Jerry's Diner. The railroad tracks ran less than 100 feet from the back of our house, which is adjacent to the diner. The train crew would stop the train behind the diner so the crew could have lunch. As a little boy, I would go sit in the diner and love to hear their stories. They told me some pretty tall tales. My favorite railroad man was Ray Perkins. They just called him Perkins. This is a 1950 photo of Perkins with the steam locomotive that used to come through Marienville and for which Perkins was a fireman. I remember how sad Perkins was when he told me about how the last steamer would be coming through Marienville. It was May 14th, 1955. My 5th birthday was coming up in 10 days. Perkins would be fireman on the last run. My parents encouraged my passion when they brought me my first Lionel train for Christmas when I was only 6 years old. It was much like the steam engine I used to see coming through Marienville. These pictures are of the Lionel train I now own as an older man. When I was in 2nd grade, I got into trouble for climbing the ladder on a boxcar that was about where the one appears in the photo. That was within a few hundred feet of the Marienville train station. For the rest of the school year, I was escorted to the school by my big sister, Linda. One of the most memorable experiences in my life was when Dad talked Perkins into giving me a cab ride in a B&O diesel train from Marienville to Kane. I was 14. One of my favorite pictures ever was this one I took of the train crossing the bridge near Kane. The locomotive was one of the earliest diesels on the line. I remember this person, who seemed like a really old man to me then, Mr. Claire Chips, who had come to eat at the diner. I learned more about Mr. Chips and his wife Leona from the wonderful book published in 1976 about the history of Marienville. It was compiled by the Women's Club of Marienville. Claire Chips and Leona were leading citizens of Marienville. I found this 1971 picture of Leona Chips also in the Women's Club publication. In it, she is being presented a model of the new Marionville Area Civic Association building by then President Robert Snyder and Dr. Albert Lansing. The organization was known as MACA. Back to Mr. Chips. He was the last station master for the B&O. He held that position for an astonishing 43 years from 1916 until 1959. It would have meant that he was station master when the last steam engine came through. Here's a picture of Mr. Chips sitting at the Gold Standard National Bank, where he was a bank official after he retired from the railroad. He got the job because he had accumulated so much money there. He never owned a car. The last thing I want to share from the Women's Club's publication is this fascinating picture of a 1906 train wreck in Marienville when the engine struck a cow. And I remember when I was much older and had a family of my own, my ride in one of the coaches of the Knox and Kane train to the Kinzua Bridge. I remember the thrill of riding across the bridge with the silent prayer that this would not be the day, after 110 years standing, that the bridge would collapse into the Kinzua Creek Valley below. The train station, which now stands, was built after the horrific 1902 fire, which destroyed almost everything in Marienville. This is to include the old train station, the water tank, 8 cars, and half-mile of track. The B&O rebuilt the water tank and the tracks right away because of necessity. However, they did not rebuild the station for 2 years, working out of an old coach instead. Our station is now 110 years old and not only represents railroad history, but also is the centerpiece of the history for the whole region. So how did the railroad get built through Marienville? The first rails were laid through Marienville by the Pittsburgh, Bradford, and Buffalo Railroad in 1881. The Pittsburgh, Bradford, and Buffalo Railroad built a narrow-gauge line through the Pennsylvania wilderness up through what is now the Allegheny National Forest and into the Pennsylvania wilds. It began at Callery, which is on the main line between Youngstown and Pittsburgh. The line eventually reached Mt Jewett to the north. It became known as the Northern Sub. The line crossed the Allegheny River at Foxburg and went through towns such as Knox, Lucinda, Marionville, and Kane. There was also a line to the town of Clarion off the Northern Sub at Shippenville. The line to Clarion used a spectacular bridge across the Clarion River. At 228 feet, the Clarion River Bridge was the world's longest deck-howl truss. This bridge was in operation into the late 1800s. At Foxburg, there was an exchange track with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a line that ran from Pittsburgh to Warren, Pennsylvania, along the Allegheny River Valley. The Northern Sub also exchanged with the Pennsylvania Railroad at Kane. The Northern Sub had an intersection with the narrow-gauge Tonesta Valley Railroad at Sheffield Junction, which was north of Pigeon and before Russell City. Sheffield Junction was in operation in the late 1800s and up until about 1941. The name of the railroad passing the Marionville station's platform changed over time. It began with the Pittsburgh, Bradford, and Buffalo Railroad as early as 1881. Then, in 1883, the Pittsburgh and Western took over and would be the predominant railroad for the next 20 years. It was all narrow gauge then, 3 feet between the rails on the Northern Sub. The Pittsburgh and Western was an amalgamation of various lines built separately by other lines and itself. Here's a map of the Pittsburgh and Western Railroad. Notice that a predominant feature of the B&W would be the line from Butler to Mt Jewett through Marienville. It also had distant connections with Toledo and Chicago. The B&O and Pittsburgh and Western Railroads were closely related organizationally and legally as far back as February 1884, when the B&O bought control of the P&W. Officers of the B&O were officers in the P&W. The railroads were operationally intertwined. The B&O began operating the Pittsburgh and Western as an integral part of its systems on February 1st, 1902. Royal blue began to adorn the rolling stock on the Northwest Sub. The Northern Sub, which passed through Marionville, used some of the most bizarre and creative railroading in the eastern United States. It started with this double-deck bridge, which was used to cross the Allegheny River at Foxburg. It had a highway on the bottom and the railroad on the top. Then the branch used a track configuration at Foxburg called a switchback to climb up and out of the steep Allegheny River Valley in its journey toward Knox, Marionville, and beyond. The switchback placed a limitation on the length of trains which could come up out of Foxburg to that whose length would fit on the overshoot past the switches on the switchback. This was about 8 to 12 full-size cars. Longer trains were possible, but had to be reassembled on a siding toward Knox. Even toward its final days in the 21st century, the line continued to make extensive use of wooden trestles. These trestles looked something like you would see in the Old West. Some of these trestles had sharp turns, such as this one at Paint Creek near Shippenville. The northern sub through Marienville was the last section of the B&O to convert from narrow to standard gauge tracks. That is, tracks widened from 3 feet between the rails to 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails. This conversion was made in Marienville on October 1st, 1911. The entire 126 miles of track between Foxburg through Marienville and to Mt Jewett was made overnight by a small army of men. Here is a photo of one of the work crews at Lucinda preparing for the change. This is the last narrow gauge freight train, and then this is the last narrow gauge passenger train to pass through Marienville. Operations were made more complicated during the 10 years of there being both gauges on the system. In Foxburg, it required that there would be 3 rails, a common rail, then a rail for the narrow gauge, and another rail for the standard gauge, as you can see in this photo. In this photo of a narrow gauge train, we notice that the baggage car behind the engine is full size, while the cars behind it are smaller. And the last passenger train came through Marienville on January 31st, 1933. The last steam locomotive ran in 1955. Locomotives being used up until that point were 50 years old, being built in 1905. They looked like something out of an old western. Here is a 1964 picture showing one of the earlier diesels. From the very beginning, the northern sub had competition for services between Butler and Mt Jewett. In March of 1887, the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh Railroad was formed to connect from Buffalo and Rochester to Bradford, Mt Jewett, Johnsonburg, Ridgeway, DuBois, Punxsutawney, then to Butler. While a longer run than the northern sub, it boasted heavier tracks and less severe curves, and in some places double trackage. It had a higher speed limit than did the northern sub and did not have the bottleneck of the Foxburg switchback. It was estimated that the tracks on the northern sub were on curves 55% of the time. In January 1st, 1931, the B&O purchased the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh Railroad and operated it in parallel with the northern sub, calling it the Buffalo Division. What proved to be the salvation for the northern sub, despite the superior route provided by the Buffalo Division, was the freight of the glass factories in Marienville and Knox. This proved true until 1982, when both factories closed. What was once the Buffalo Division of the B&O continues in operation today as the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad. Here is some recent 2013 action on the Buffalo and Pittsburgh passing through DuBois. A huge change occurred in the northern sub in 1982. With the closing of the glass factory, the B&O filed to abandon the line. Fortunately, Sloan Cornell purchased the line and called it the Knox and Kane Railway. The newly formed Knox and Kane Railroad purchased the track and the right-of-way from Knox to Mt Jewett. The diagram helps see this better. By this time, the northern sub had been broken into segments. The southern segment between Petrolia and East Butler had been taken over by the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad to service the in-spec petroleum product plants. The middle segment between Knox and Petrolia was abandoned, thus meaning the end of the line for railroading in Foxburg. So Sloan Cornell purchased the remaining segment between Knox and Kane, thus forming the Knox and Kane Railroad. The new owner, Cornell, was a longtime train enthusiast, and he had a plan. It was his hope to expand the railroad to go from Marienville in the south all the way to the Kinzua Bridge in the north. This would make a complete round trip of 97 miles, and the all-day excursion would include the option to cross the famed bridge. In 1986, Sloan Cornell signed a 35-year lease to take over the operation and use of the bridge. After inspecting the bridge for safety and laying new track from Mt Jewett to the bridge, a Y was constructed at the north end of the bridge for turning locomotives. A Baldwin 280 steam locomotive, number 38, would make the first crossing. When the consist reached the viaduct in the mid-afternoon, the train was stopped so that those passengers who did not wish to challenge the span could disembark before the train crossed the bridge. Then slowly, and ever so gingerly, number 38 eased forward onto the bridge. This was a great day for Cornell and the Knox and Kane Railroad, and a day of glory for rail fans. This was the first train to cross the viaduct in 28 years. Once safely across the bridge, number 38 was disconnected from the rest of the train and turned on the Y. A proud moment for Sloan Cornell, because after 28 years, the towering structure now was an operating part of the railroad's daily excursion route. Number 38 was the prime steam power for the Knox and Kane Railroad from 1987 until 1990, sometimes getting assistance from diesel power. But the aging number 38 was reaching the end of its lifespan. The railroad was increasing in popularity and the trains increased in length. It became apparent that a new, more powerful locomotive was needed. So owner Cornell began looking into acquiring another steam locomotive. The result of his search was to purchase a brand new steam locomotive to be built for the Knox and Kane Railroad by the Tangshan Locomotive Works in China. Officially designated SY 1658M, the M suffix indicating the locomotive was built to American specifications. It was built under the direct supervision of Mr. Cornell and delivered in May of 1990. After coming into operation, the locomotive's designation became simply number 58. Here we see number 58 departing Marionville for its maiden run to the Kinzua Bridge. It was May 1990. Now, after traveling 49 miles, number 58 is arriving at the Kinzua Bridge, about to make its first crossing. Having turned at the Y, the locomotive began its return trip across the bridge. On the way home, the excursion train crossed Route 66 at Pigeon, which is about 6 miles north of Marionville. Pigeon was named after the now extinct passenger pigeon, which used to flock to the area by the millions. Finally, the train reaches its home in Marionville. One aspect of Knox and Kane Railroad operations that not everybody knows about was its freight business. In this photo, the GP9 is hauling empty boxcars over the trestle near Route 6 near Kane. These boxcars were used for fiberboard at Clarion Boards in Shippenville. These cars were all taken to the Buffalo and Pittsburgh interchange point in Mt Jewett. Here is a photo of freight operations from 2007 taken by Kevin Ashbaugh in the countryside. Here's a shot of winter freight operations on January 30th, 2003. The GP9 is pulling freight through the PA State game lands. Floyd Gabriel took the picture. Mr. Jerry Schleicher of Erie Valley Videos is seen videotaping the train. But time had not been kind to the Knox and Kane Railroad. A long series of setbacks began. State inspectors became concerned about corrosion in the base of the towers. In 2002, they closed the bridge to both rail and pedestrian traffic until comprehensive inspections could be performed. It would never be opened again. In 2003, an aggressive program to repair corrosion and restore the viaduct began. But in July, shortly after crews had stopped working for the day, an F1 tornado scored a direct hit on the structure, causing the center section of the viaduct to collapse. Its fate was now sealed. The state of Pennsylvania, not being able to finance the estimated $45 million cost of rebuilding the bridge, opted instead to construct the Sky Walk, which gave park visitors the opportunity to view the Kinzua Gorge from a platform 600 feet out. It was open to the public in September of 2011. Enough about the bridge for now. Let's get back to the Knox and Kane. Operations continued into 2004 with the trains running up to the edge of the viaduct. But with the main appeal of the excursion gone, ridership on the line fell off drastically and revenues plummeted. The trains stopped. The death blow to the Knox and Kane Railroad came in the form of an engine house fire by arson in March of 2008. All of the railroad's locomotives and several of the coaches were damaged or destroyed. The sad finale to the Knox and Kane Railroad was the auction of all property on October 11 and 12, 2008. All rolling stock, property, motive power, memorabilia, track, and land were on the auction block. The silver lining to the heartbreaking engine house fire is this. The Valley Railroad in Essex, Connecticut purchased the fire-damaged Chinese-built number 1568 at the October 2008 auction. After a meticulous 3-year restoration process, they returned her to full functionality. They renumbered her Valley 3025 with New Haven markings. In this November 2011 clip, she is showing her stuff in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, and her first outing since the rebuild. The Valley Railroad is using the old Knox and Kane Railroad locomotive number 58 in their Your Hand on the Throttle program, as well as their train and riverboat program. The railroad was purchased by the Kovalchik Corporation, a salvage company from Indiana, Pennsylvania, Joe Kovalchik, president. They have a long history in the railroad business. The Kovalchik Corporation began removing the track for scrap from Shippenville in the south, working toward the north. As of the summer of 2013, they had completed track removal up to the Route 66 crossing at Pigeon, which is 6 miles north of Marionville, toward Kane. They are well over halfway done. In this video clip, the coal chip crews are collecting ties, the rails having already been removed. By midsummer 2017, the removal of the tracks up through Mt Jewett to the Kinzua Bridge were complete. In this photo by Chris Bingham, the tracks have been removed through Mt Jewett. The right-of-way of the former Knox and Kane Railroad has become the 76.1-mile Knox and Kane Rail Trail. It starts at Clarion Junction in Shippenville and passes through Lucinda, Leeper, Marienville, Russell City, Kane, and Mt Jewett, and then on to the Kinzua Bridge Sky Walk. The trail has been divided into segments which have been taken over by different entities. Two notable ones are the Marionville Four Seasons Trail and Hub Club and the Mt Jewett to Kinzua Bridge Trail Club. The Mt Jewett to Kinzua Bridge Trail Club is just one of the volunteer organizations taking stewardship over a segment of the 76.1-mile Knox and Kane Rail Trail, but they are responsible for the rail trail from Lance Corners to Kinzua Bridge State Park and the Skywalk going through Mt Jewett. That segments of the trail include horseback riding, snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, and pedestrian activities like sightseeing nature while walking or running. The website for the organization is www.mj2kb.trailclub. Another significant rail trail effort is being made in Marionville by Jenks Township supervisors and the citizens of Marionville. The former Knox and Kane Railroad right-of-way is being developed into a multi-purpose Four Seasons recreational trail. The Marionville train station, which is undergoing extensive refurbishing, will be the hub. If anyone has comments or is desiring more information about this video, they can contact Mikado Rail Productions using the information provided.